Hello everyone and good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joe and I'm from the Festival of Debate based here in Sheffield. For those of you who might not have come across the Festival of Debate before, we're a platform created for people to come together to discuss the key social, environmental and political issues of the day. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's event. Now, all Festival of Debate events are free at the point of access, but we do rely on donations to help us make it happen. If you're in a position to donate tonight, I'll be putting the donate link in the chat, or if you're watching this event afterwards on YouTube, you should be able to see the donate link in the talk description. Thank you very much. I'm now going to introduce our chair for tonight's event. Please welcome Granville Williams. If you'd like to turn your video on, Granville.
Hello, good evening and welcome. My name is Granville Williams and I'm really pleased to be a partner with Festival of Debate for this event. I edit a magazine called Media North and we've got two events in this Festival of Debate. But this one, the official secrets and its impact on journalism and whistleblowers, is the first. And we originally wanted to do this because back in May 2021, Priti Patel put out a consultation on official secrets, and because of the pandemic, the attention it should have received, it didn't get. So that's the first reason why we're organising this event tonight. But secondly, we've obviously in the last few months witnessed a pretty disgraceful attempt by the UK government to support the extradition of Julian Assange. And so the issues that are raised there, of course, go back to 2020 when Julian Assange leaked, the Wikileaks were leaked, and essentially he's been charged with espionage, and that in the United States, if he was sent there, means a hefty, decade-long prison sentence. So what WikiLeaks published, of course, exposed both war crimes and other human rights abuses. It was in the public interest. And this is the problem with official secrecy, that often it seeks to clamp down and avoid any kind of daylight being shown on all kinds of actions that take place undercover, outside of the view of the press. And that's why it's so vital, the role of journalists and whistleblowers, to be able to bring these sorts of stories to light. So I'm very, very pleased. It's a timely meeting, one that I hope people will find informative, controversial as well, but also one that you will want to put questions to the speakers. So the way I'd like to run the event is this: I'm going to ask the four speakers to make some short introductory comments, 4 or 5 minutes long, and then to have an exchange of views between the panelists and then open it up to the questions that we hope you're going to contribute. So that's all I want to say. I want now to hand over to Michelle Stanley, but let me briefly introduce her first. Michelle is General Secretary of the NUJ, third term as General Secretary. And I think I'm very proud, by the way, to be a member of the NUJ because it has a really strong record in terms of its support for its members who are themselves threatened either through official secrecy or other forms of pressure that the government and the police can put on journalists to disclose activity. Most notably recently, of course, Chris Mullin and the West Midlands Police Force seeking to get access to his private sources on the Birmingham Six case. So I'd like very much to welcome Michelle to set the scene, if you want, on the background to the threats posed by Priti Patel's consultation and her proposals on official secrets. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Granville, and thanks for organising such a timely and important discussion and inviting the NUJ to be part of it. The so-called reforms of the Official Secrets Act planned by this government are important, I think, to anyone who cares about journalism and anyone who prizes the role that press freedom plays in our democracy. There isn't clarity on when the new bill will land. We know it'll come as part of a broader clutch of changes under the Counter States Threats Bill. So it's really important that opposition to those elements that deal with the Official Secrets Act's changes are kept in focus, and that they're not lost in the wider issues of counter-espionage and hostile activity, particularly against the current backdrop of war in Ukraine. You mentioned the consultation that was published last May. It ran to the end of July, and there's not been any further response yet to those responses from the government, but it's likely that could be contained within the Queen's speech on the 10th of May. And these reforms of the proposed bill have been called the gravest threat to public interest journalism in a generation for a reason. The NUJ has been campaigning alongside other groups against changes that we absolutely know will compromise public service, public interest journalism. They'll criminalise journalists, and we certainly encouraged all of our members to participate in that consultation last year. If these changes come about, they'll see journalists being treated as spies simply for doing their job. The consultation suggested that journalists should be treated in the same way as those who leak information and those committing espionage offences. Part of that was a proposal to increase maximum sentences from 2 years to 14 years. It claimed that whistleblowing and the release of documents and information online could sometimes be an even more grievous act than that of spying by a hostile agent. The Law Commission's recommendations came out back in our call for a public interest defence for journalists and for anyone charged with an unauthorised disclosure under the Official Secrets Act. They've also proposed establishing an independent statutory commissioner to investigate concerns of wrongdoing from whistleblowers. And the legal profession are absolutely clear too that the distinction between espionage and an unauthorised disclosure is a really vital one to retain. We've seen since from the Home Office assurances that journalists will remain free to hold the government to account, something that sounds desperately hollow and utterly unconvincing to me and to NUJ members. Existing legislation distinguishes provisions and penalties between those who leak or whistleblow and those who've received leaked information and foreign spies, but these proposals will eliminate or blur those distinctions. And so far, the government's pretty much ruled out any journalistic safeguards. In fact, they say that safeguards would risk undermining their efforts to crack down on these damaging unauthorised disclosures. And they rather pompously suggest that that wouldn't be in our interest as a public. Their plans also shift the emphasis about whether there's proof that a disclosure was damaging to a mere capability for a publication to be damaging, saying that proof would be a barrier to potential prosecutions, and that's also very alarming. The government's claimed that whistleblowers and journalists can't accurately judge whether the public interest in disclosing information outweighs the risks against disclosure. And I'm pretty certain that most people here this evening would sooner trust the instinctive and considered judgments of whistleblowers and of journalists rather than that of a government whose default position is secrecy when it comes to weighing up what information we should be privy to or not. And the reality is we know there's so many countless occasions on which the government's used the official secrets provisions to protect information that reveals incompetence, wastefulness and dishonesty, and the danger of criminalising decent people who feel impelled to expose that wrongdoing and to put information into the public domain is absolutely clear. It'd risk our right as a public to know, and it would mean that journalists simply couldn't do their job properly. We're also, as a union, really concerned that the planned reforms will water down protections for special procedures material, which includes journalistic material currently under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. It appears that the government would want such protections to be invalid under Official Secrets Act searches, and the threshold for authorising those searches would also be lower. And I think it's really important in considering this that the climate that journalists currently operate in, it's increasingly difficult and challenged. We frequently, as a union, support legal challenges against our members where their journalistic material and their footage has been seized by police who are often misusing journalists as shortcuts in their own investigations. And the notion that this is made even easier for them to get away with that is really dangerous. Just last month, as Granville mentioned, we won the case against NUJ Life member Chris Mullen that had been brought by West Midlands Police. And that's about the Birmingham Six Bombings, a case as old as I am. And it was a case that frankly never should have got off the ground, but we don't see it as an outlier. We see such attempts all too frequently. There was the case of Belfast-based journalists Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey that many of you may be aware of. Their homes and offices were raided by police with a search warrant that later a judge ruled was obtained in a hearing that fell woefully short of the standard required. And currently a court has to rule on police applications to inspect journalistic material. But under the Official Secrets Act proposals, these protections would be watered down and it would only need a police superintendent to authorise search warrants and inspections of special procedure material. And I think we saw in that case, the No Stone Unturned case, an absolutely clear demonstration of how tempting it can be for police to use official secrets provisions on the flimsiest of grounds. And take another recent case as well brought under the current legislation. The BBC has been blocked from identifying an alleged MI5 informant who, according to witness statements from two women, had used his status to control and coerce them. It was a case that, to me, to any other journalist, would seem to absolutely be in the public interest for that man's name to be disclosed. But the BBC doesn't even know what the reasons are for the injunction, because a significant proportion of the evidence in that case was heard in a closed hearing, which, despite being a party, the BBC wasn't even permitted to attend. So I think that broader context, that overarching scenario that all journalists face every day is incredibly important. These potential changes are coming at a time when press freedom is under attack, not just in countries run by despots around the world, but absolutely here in the UK as well. We've seen a raid by the Information Commissioner to find the Sun's Matt Hancock scoop source. We're seeing increasing acts of lawfare designed to stymie and to thwart journalistic reporting and investigations. And it's bully boy tactics like that that are aimed very squarely at creating a chilling effect and bringing about a culture of more risk-averse reporting. And so that's why the NUJ's commitment to defending journalists and journalism that operates in the public interest is absolutely undaunted. It's one of our key campaigns, and it's why we need everyone that cares about media freedom to campaign with us. It's so important, I think, that we come together and collectively fight off these attempts by the government to change the law and make it harder for journalists to report and for whistleblowers to do the right thing. So that's why I'm very pleased to be here, hopefully with lots of like-minded people who will join that effort after this evening. Thanks, Granville.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. That set the scene, highlighting what's contained in this dangerous set of proposals that are in the consultation. Martin Bright has just joined us, but I hope Martin now will be able to pick up the threads and continue. Welcome, Martin. First of all, you're the editor at large at the moment of Index on Censorship, but in the past you've been Home Affairs editor of The Observer, and in that time you covered the David Shayler disclosures when he was an MI5 officer of a plot to topple Libya's Colonel Gaddafi. And more recently, your claim to fame, and indeed fame on film with the Official Secrets film, was to do with the Catherine and Gunn case. So what I'd like you to do is maybe, Martin, share your perceptions of how you see the threats of the Official Secret Act proposals in the consultation in terms of whistleblowers and other ways in which journalists get vital sources of information. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Granville, and apologies for my late arrival. Yes, I, in fact, been involved in 3 official secrecy prosecutions. The first was David Shaler, the MI5 officer who made various disclosures about what he saw as wrongdoing within the intelligence services, including, as you say, an alleged plot to topple Colonel Gaddafi. This ended up with him being prosecuted, but in the meantime, the authorities tried to bring the Observer and the Guardian, indeed, into the prosecution. They attempted to obtain evidence from us that would help them to prosecute David, and we refused to hand over our documents, and therefore we had to fight off. Special branch, and indeed at the time changed the law in terms of the sanctity of journalistic material. I was subsequently involved, yes, in the Catherine Gunn affair, which was turned into the film Official Secrets. And again, Catherine Gunn was disclosing information that she believed to be in the public interest. I think probably most of us on this call would agree that it was indeed in the public interest to disclose information about essentially an attempt to fix the vote at the United Nations in the advance of a war in Iraq. And then the third case was the case of Derek Pasquill. It's a lesser known case. Derek was a Foreign Office official who leaked details of Foreign Office and Home Office links to radical Islamist organizations. Now, what I would say is that in all of these cases, the existing official secrets legislation was pretty tough, pretty draconian, and led to, these prosecutions, each of which had clear public interest argument, I would say, pretty well established public interest for the information to be disclosed, but there is, as we know, no public interest defense. Now, what concerns me about the new legislation, and then we can move on and I can answer questions later if need be. What concerns me about the new legislation is that not only are the punishments more severe, and I'm sure Michelle's gone into this, and the eliding of journalists and spies means that journalists will potentially receive greater punishments than people who are leaking information, who are doing so because they are traitors. That's one thing that concerns me, but possibly even more is the concern that I outlined in Index on Censorship and indeed in the British Journalism Review, that it does seem to me that each of these 3 cases I've just outlined were poor prosecutions. They failed because they should not have been taken in the first place. And what the new guidance to the proposed legislation suggests is that the government is simply trying to make it easier for themselves to prosecute. So really, they're attacking a problem of their own making. These prosecutions have largely been incompetent. And if they're simply making it easier for them to launch incompetent prosecutions, I think we should all be worried about that. Okay, I'll stop there and then I can come back if need be. Thanks, Granville.
Sorry,
You're
Granville,
muted.
you need to unmute. Sorry, Granville, you need to unmute.
So apologies there. I thought I'd unmuted myself. Thanks, Martin. You reminded me when you said about prosecutions should be made. It reminded me of Peter Wright's spy capture and the ignominious way in which the government went around the world trying to block the publication of the book. Thank you very much for that. I want to move on now to Annie Machon. Annie's a former intelligence officer with MI5, and she resigned in the late 1990s. She's now an international public speaker, speaking to us from Brussels. And in 2020, Annie was given the Sam Adams Award for integrity in intelligence. And that was in recognition of her advocacy work for whistleblowers over the previous decade. So over to you, Annie, for your perspectives on our topic of tonight.
Thank you very much, Granville, and also thank you, Martin. It's lovely to see you again. I remember how brave you were in trying to expose the allegations that David Shayler made. So thank you for that. What I want to do tonight is very briefly just run over the whistleblowing story that David Shayler and I went through. David Shayler was my former partner and former colleague in MI5. We were both intelligence whistleblowers there. And we resigned after trying to change the system from within in order to expose a whole series of crimes. Illegal files held on government ministers, bombs put down by the provisional IRA that could and should have been prevented, and then the government was lied to about what caused them, innocent people going to prison, and as Martin mentioned, an illegal assassination attempt by MI6 to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi, which went wrong and killed innocent people. So there was a whole stack of stuff that we were concerned about, and not just us, but also many of our colleagues who also resigned around the same time. But we had the freedom to try and blow the whistle about it. Now, the cost of that, of course, we knew what it was. And I do want to just sum up what the Official Secrets Acts mean, because in the UK, the 1911 Act, Official Secrets Act, is there to stop traitors, people who want to, betray our country and give secrets to an enemy. And what the 1989 Official Secrets Act was put in place to do was effectively to stifle whistleblowers and journalists. So that meant that anyone who blew the whistle from the government or from the intelligence agencies or from the military would face 2 years in prison per charge. And it also meant that journalists trying to do that would face the same. What we are looking at the moment, though, is an amalgamation of this into what is going to affect journalists and whistleblowers going forward in the future. So we have a situation where both whistleblowers and journalists will now face 14 years in prison per charge if they were to go public about the crimes or misdemeanors or malfeasance of the spies. And this is the prison tariff that was put in place under the 1911 Act to persecute traitors. So I have watched with horrified interest over the last few years about how the government is trying to amalgamate and reform the Official Secrets Act into this new Espionage Act, and the fact that it is going to affect journalists far more than it has in the past, because they've always had didn't cause damage defense. But what we are now looking at is that journalists and whistleblowers will both face that with a no legal defense. And watching the very well written and very well argued pieces about this new proposed legislation has been interesting, but it's always focused on the journalists. It has not focused on the whistleblower, the source of the discussion, the source of the information. And that I find disturbing, shall I say, that journalists of course need to have, but we need to have a free press. We need them to be able to report this stuff, but they should also recognize the sacrifice, professional, social, familial, even liberty-wise, that the whistleblower might potentially face if they are not being protected and campaigned for by the journalists. Just before we started this session, also Granville asked me about Wikileaks. So this is a subject that I have been hugely supportive of ever since I met Julian Assange way back in 2009. And he asked me at the last minute just to give a talk about the spies and the media, which led to a whole raft of other work. And so this was at a Hackerfest. And I am so distressed at what is being done to Julian Assange as the founder and head of WikiLeaks, in terms of he's a high-tech publisher, he is an award-winning journalist, and yet he's being hung out to dry by the international media across the planet. And I just find that disgusting. This is a guy who provided protection for whistleblowers. This is a guy who has broken so many stories. And this is a guy who's not being accorded the same journalistic rights as, for example, the New York Times or the Guardian or Der Spiegel or whatever. And it's just, you know, the law has got to apply to everyone equally. You can't just penalize people under some US Espionage Act. And I will raise this particular point too. In 2016, when the whole Russiagate story broke, you know, in America, about the Russians hacking the American election and getting Donald Trump in power and all that sort of thing, there was something that was called the Dirty Dossier that was published by a former MI6 officer called Christopher Steele. This is all about, you know, Trump and golden showers and all sorts of hideous stuff going on in Moscow. And there was then a court case in 2018. And in this case, which was held in an American court, which was brought by a Russian oligarchs who felt that they had been traduced reputationally, Christopher Steele, the former MI6 officer, British resident, British national living in Britain, was then granted under this US court the right to the First Amendment, which is freedom of expression, i.e. freedom of the press. And this is specifically what is being denied even before Julian Assange is going to be extradited to America. So I think that everyone working in the media across the world, any investigative journalists, needs to be aware of this, because any investigative journalist in the future is potentially going to be at risk of extradition to the US for a breach of their Espionage Act. And when the UK brings in their new Espionage Act, which is going to be a souped up version of the Official Secrets Act, that could also happen in our country. So the media needs to wake up. The media needs to know what the secrecy laws are. And the media needs to get teched up as well to protect themselves and also to protect their sources. And this is what WikiLeaks tried to do. I think also the one other final point I want to make around this is when they are trying to pull together this new Espionage Act in the UK, they're not just going to increase the tariffs in prison for whistleblowers or for journalists up to 14 years. One of the other proposals has been to block the prior publication defense, which was one under the Peter Wright spycatcher law cases way back in the late 1980s, which, for example, would mean that I cannot, because I have already published, I've written this stuff, it's been cleared by MI5, I would never again be allowed to talk about it, and nor would any other journalist. And that is frightening, because that is actually making people disappear from history. It's a Stalin-esque, it's airbrushing from history. And I find that really frightening. And people are not focusing on that. So just to wrap up, the two key points. I think it's wonderful that there's been a huge media outcry trying to push back against this reform of the Official Secrets Act, making it into an Espionage Act. But I'm also very concerned that there's no emphasis on the whistleblower rather than the journalist. And I'm very concerned about the prior publication loss of defense. So I'll finish with that. Very happy to talk about it later.
That's great. Very powerful points there. Thank you very much, Annie. Can I encourage people, please, if you need to, I'd like you to get some Q&As in, well, some questions first of all, and you get the answers later on. There's a little box there, please go to it, and we could choose the ones that are getting the high scores to select. Okay, on to our fourth speaker, Stephen Doral. Stephen's been an author, researcher, an investigative journalist, since the 80s, early 80s?
Something like that, long time.
Yeah, well, I remember you from the 80s anyway. He's a specialist in the security and intelligence services, and his books include a book that got reviews that were absolutely amazing, Black Shirt on the life of Oswald Mosley, and MI6, 50 Years of Special Operations. He's now honorary research fellow at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Leicester. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Granville. Yes, I'm a semi-retired academic researching specifically nowadays MI5 and MI6, mostly historical, but it has become increasingly difficult to do it because the government is already using an array of means to close down access to material. But today, by coincidence, I got this book, and it's by the son of an MI6 officer, and it's the letters of his father, who's an senior figure in MI6, to his wife in the early 1950s. So we're talking about 70 years ago. The officer is very careful about what he writes, but he uses acronyms, initials for names. Now, given that I've been doing this a long time, I know who those names are and I can work them out. But that, I think, under the Act would make me liable, discovering that kind of material. And the person who published the book is probably liable under this new Act. It's events 70 years ago, but technically it breaks the Official Secrets Act, particularly MI6, who don't release any files at all and make a great thing of that. And it's very difficult to do any kind of investigation of MI6, even historical events. And the decision of whether that would be in the public interest would be up to a civil servant. You probably couldn't cross-examine and seek out what his real motives were. And it's almost like certain to be an MI5 officer who decides whether or not access to that, publishing it, doing an article about it, a book, etc., is in the public interest. The problem here is this prior publication, which would really hit me, as Annie said, because I kind of operate on the principle that we now live in a world where there are, in fact, few secrets. The internet, social media, etc., gives us access to a huge amount of material. Of course, most of the time it's rubbish, and most of the time it's such a flood that it's very difficult to make much sense of the world. But I spend my time reading books, academic articles, files, and I'm looking for these bits of the jigsaw. I'm putting these little bits of information together to create the big jigsaw, the big picture, to find out about what MI5, MI6 did 30, 40, 50 years ago. And to my mind, this has nothing to do with national security or official secrets anymore. The problem is we live in a very, very secretive kind of society. And just as this flood of information is coming out, the government is on the other side trying to stop it. And they're making every effort to do that. So files from the end of the empire were deliberately destroyed. They were hidden. Access to them has become very difficult. And still, the large areas, what took place in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we know very, very little about. My book on MI6 was published in 2000, and in 20 years, although there have been a number of books, I don't really think we are much further forward in finding out about what MI6 did in the 50s and 60s. A minister said we'd still be able to hold the government to account, but can we really hold MI5 and MI6 to account with the new act? And I would suggest no. I mean, we've seen a number of terrible cases in recent years, MI5, MI6 officers being party to torture, the rendition of people, and it's been hard enough finding that out. But under the new act, I think it'd be basically impossible. And it connects to other attempts the government is attempting to curtail access to information. The Freedom of Information Act we have in this country is a very, very poor relation to the one in the United States or Scandinavian countries or even Germany. There have been big efforts to try and tighten access to that. And there's a unit that looks at specific inquiries under the Act to try and stop them. And there is quite clear an effort to deny access to material. And even when you get the files, often it's all blacked out. So the problem is the underlying British disease of secrecy, which this new act plays into. Most leaks are actually by the government. If you read British newspapers, you will see an intelligence source said, a security source said, and we've seen a lot of it in the last couple of months over Ukraine, revealing information, which again, technically you could argue breaks the Official Secrets Act. But nothing is done about that. It's about opening up government, keeping people to account. Most of the use of the Official Secrets Act is this chilling effect to stop people talking. And you can approach, 90-year-old MI6 officers and say, could you talk about events in the 1940s? Oh, sorry, old boy, I can't do that. That's the Official Secrets Act. I can't do it. And if I did do that, they'd take my pension away. And this kind of thing is often used. And it's not anything to do with national security. It's embarrassment, it's political, it's protecting information, access into information. And in reality, we should really be liberalizing the Official Secrets Act, not making it more draconian. I think they're going to find it very difficult in the end to actually make this work, because I think the first thing that will happen is people will go to the European courts to have a go at this, which is, of course, why the Conservative government wants us to withdraw from European courts and oversee it here. Finally, Annie knows this better than anybody else, the problems that whistleblowers have. I'm currently writing a book about a whistleblower. And if this act was in, it would make it much more difficult. Most whistleblowers, their lives are totally destroyed. They lose their jobs, marriages break down, they lose their homes, no one wants to employ them, and there's no real protection. And this will make it, again, a lot worse. So I think we really have to fight this act as much as we can. Because again, it's just this, we live in a very secretive society. It runs through everything. And this attempt to stop the public citizens having right of access to information is ingrained in the whole state and the whole system. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks ever so much, Steve. Okay, so we've had 4 quite sharp, focused presentations. Just before and also we're beginning to get the questions coming in, but before we move on to general responses and questions, I'd like to begin to also ask the panel if they want to comment on contributions by the other speakers. So would anybody like to indicate that? Any questions that I'd like to focus on with other people on the panel? Anybody? Yeah, Martin?
Yes, I'd just like to follow up on Stephen's extremely important final point there about the toll on whistleblowers. Now, I mean, Annie will know this with at great personal cost to herself. And it is certainly the case that the three whistleblowers that I've dealt with, David Shayler and his former partner, Catherine Gunn and Derek, they have suffered greatly as a result. And one of the things that it's important to remember is a lot of what happens with official secrets prosecutions is not like other prosecutions. They are designed to destroy people, and they are designed to deter people. Now, in the case of Catherine Gunn's prosecution, and actually a number of official secrets prosecutions, they don't succeed. But often that's not really the point. The point is that the process is so difficult, so undermining for the individuals that that this has the effect of deterring others as a result. And, this is one of the reasons that there aren't more official secret prosecutions, of course. What the government will not tell you is that actually this chilling effect is what they are intending in the first place.
Yes.
Now, I cannot emphasize too strongly how devastating this is for the individuals involved. People retain their sanity for a long time, but ultimately, I have not known a whistleblower that I've worked with. I mean, and I hope this isn't to do with me, that hasn't eventually found life extremely difficult. I'm not sure that I would ever now recommend a whistleblower coming to me or coming to the press. And if it was a friend of mine, I would tell them to think twice about ever revealing this kind of information.
Wow, that is a very strong statement, Martin. I remember how supportive and interested you were in the case with David Shayler, and he was mentally destroyed.
Yes,
but you gave him a lot of support.
But the costs are devastating, right? I think one of the things that, I now do a lot of work with whistleblowing organizations.
Me too.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is key to working with whistleblowers is putting in place the kind of support that they need for their mental health in these situations, because the process of disclosing information in this way is beyond any one individual's capacity. It just, solidarity is everything in this. And so, one of the questions has been about sort of what we do in the future about these kinds of cases. And of course, there's been some interesting questions about Julian Assange. Solidarity is everything in these cases. Sorry to ramble on, but it was important to make that point.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for that. And again, very powerful insight. People don't think about that devastating impact on the whistleblower. They think, a lot of people think this is heroic and they ride off into the sunset. It isn't like that. Annie, did you want to come back in at all on that point?
I do, because what I witnessed with David Shayler was a dichotomy. So some of the press said he should be horsewhipped, or he should be shot, or he should be assassinated. Some of the press said he was a hero. So living with that dichotomy for years caused an immense amount of psychological stress. And then we've seen what's happened to Julian Assange, as Martin mentioned. And he's not a whistleblower, he's a bloody publisher and an award-winning journalist. But he's also been attacked and treated in the same way and spied on in the same way. That tension, that you're evil, you're good, you're a hero, you're a devil, and then also the lack of privacy that you experience in your life is really, really, really hard to deal with. And that's what we've seen, I think, in the most extreme example with the Assange case, particularly when he was stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy, which granted him, legal asylum, which is not easily granted under international law, and they still dragged him out. It's disgusting. I'm so disgusted with the fact that the press has not protected him more. I'm going to say that very strongly. I feel, he was a groundbreaking new high-tech publisher, and he exposed some very, very serious and very important information, which other organizations, other media organizations have made huge amounts of money off and had groundbreaking stories and won applause for. And I know the NUJ has supported Assange. I know various other international journalist organizations have, but I just feel disgusted that the general media has not done that.
Okay. Steve, yes, come in, please. Yeah,
I agree with all those comments. This may sound slightly bizarre, but there is a study done by an academic in America, which I go along with, and a take from that, I think that, in fact, whistleblowers are probably modern saints, in that they know their lives are going, some of them, not all of them clearly, but some of them know that their lives are going to be destroyed, but they still continue. I mean, the two cases, I've had others, but the two cases I've been involved with, and I'm still to this day, Colin Wallace and Fred Olroyd, they continue, and they will continue to the grave, because they have a moral core which probably we don't have. And they are willing to do, well, lose everything. I mean, you know, Fred's case, he has lost everything virtually, but he believes in it so strongly, he's not going to give up. And I think I admire them greatly, but there isn't the support. And certainly the state, to this day, continues to go after them. It's appalling.
Yeah, I just wondered, because I'll bring you Michelle in a minute, but I just wondered, you mentioned Fred Olroyd and Colin Wallace, but I'm aware that there'll be some people out there, Steve, who this is past history. And for us, of course, it was important because Colin Wallace, there was the great book by Paul Foote about Colin Wallace. And so I do think that just one or two words about exactly what it was that they did, please.
Colin Wallace was information officer in Northern Ireland, who was also involved in psychological operations. That was his secret remit from the government, which the government has spent 30 years denying, but we now have the written records that it was true. And most of the things that he said, we can now see that did take place. And then it gets very murky, because he was involved in a manslaughter case, which he went to prison for, which was overturned, and he was paid compensation by the government. But that case is still rolling on and is due in court in Northern Ireland in the near future. Fred Olroyd was a military intelligence officer who worked with MI6 and made claims about dirty tricks in the mid-1970s. And suddenly his case still rolls on and is also, looks like it may end up in court. So these cases go on and they go to the highest level of government. We now have correspondence with prime ministers, chiefs of MI6, all discussing these cases. And in the background is the hand of MI5 trying to close any discussion down, stop documents, etc.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. Michelle, do you want to come in on any of the points that have been raised so far?
Thanks, Granville. I think the points that Annie was making earlier are so important when, you know, in terms of any discussion around this, it's easy to focus on, you know, the law as it stands now, the law as it's being proposed in terms of reforms and what the impact might be on journalism in the broadest possible sense, on journalists as practitioners. But absolutely, in all of that discussion, whistleblowers have to be at the heart of that in how we're talking about it and how we're addressing it. And that personal impact on somebody, yes, a huge act of bravery in the first instance, but you know, the ramifications of that decision go on forever, you know, for a long, long time after that, when often perhaps the news outlets that have been running those stories have moved on to other things, you know, and I think that relationship between journalists and whistleblowers, absolutely from the NUJ's perspective and our kind of work around journalistic ethics, is absolutely central. It's a very core thing. It's a very core principle. You know, it's what impels our work on protection of sources, because it's not ever just about the individual case in question, that individual person or journalist or whistleblower. It's absolutely about the message it sends to any future whistleblower who feels impelled to share information that should be in the public domain. So we've got a vested interest in the solidarity we extend to those individuals and the support and making that count and making that be felt. So we do try and do that as the NUJ. I think we can always do better. And I really was listening to what Annie say, thinking, you know, that's absolutely got to be at the core of what we're saying in the coming weeks as well, when we're faced with potential new legislative changes to fight off.
Michelle, could I just add to that as well? I feel this urgently because for the last decade, I've been doing talks at investigative journalist conferences around Europe about, you know, how the spies and the media can intersect and be manipulated both ways. And I do think this is the key thing. It's about the pastoral care. You get a source coming to you, you get a whistleblower coming to you. How is the first contact going to be made securely? But also, how is the subsequent contact going to be made securely? And after the story breaks, how do you take care of your source? Because, as Granville said, I mean, it's impossible. And Martin said this too. It's impossible. After a big story breaks, your life is broken. How does the journalist help?
And I think that's something that, you know, a lot of journalists give a lot of thought to. I mean, and certainly it's something that engages people, and particularly more in recent years. I think, you know, there are investigative reporters who absolutely pride themselves on their tradecraft and all the different.
I would say Martin is one of them, by the way.
Absolutely, and you know, all the different practical and common sense methods and, you know, technical efforts that they put in place to make sure that people are protected and also prepared, because, as you say, you know, probably no one can really ever envisage quite what the impact might be on them and how that decision might play out. But equally, there's probably loads of other journalists who, you know, don't think they'll find themselves in that position necessarily. You know, so it's something that we've tried to raise a lot of awareness of. And I think, you know, a few years back now, when News Corps made the decision to hand over all of that data, information to the Metropolitan Police, for example, that was a major shock and a blow to many reporters who would never have thought that it would be their own employer shopping their sources to the police in that way. And there's been ramifications for some of the sources who had been pledged confidentiality, you know, as a consequence of those decisions. You know, so sometimes it's cynical corporate interests, you know, that lead to that breach of trust. So I think since then, actually, there's been a lot more awareness raised amongst the journalistic community about the need as individuals to put those protective measures in place, not to necessarily trust that the newspaper you work for has got your back. But I think that's an ongoing process, isn't it? That's something we can always be doing more on. You know, lots of local news.
We should talk more about this, Michelle.
we should. But you know, we've got cases where, you know, local news reporters have written stuff, and their source is somebody who works for the local council, and the council puts in place ridiculous draconian methods in order to track that whistleblower down, because one person's whistleblower is another person's leaker. You know, and I think that's the reality that reporters have to deal with.
Okay, I'm going to ask if any of the other panelists have got any other points that they want to raise before we move on to questions from the audience. Any other points that anybody wants to raise before we move on?
I think they have questions.
Really interesting.
Great.
Anybody else? No? Okay, well, this links partly with something that Annie's been talking about in terms of journalists supporting Julian Assange, and it's from, just let me go to the top. It's from Trevor Hoyle. Can the NUJ General Secretary say why so few journalists support Julian Assange? In fact, the vast majority are hostile to him. Can't you say why? Well, I'll pass this over to you in a minute, Michelle, but I just want to say that some of the best reporting on the trials of Julian Assange have been done by NUJ members and been put on the NUJ site. But it's an issue that I think Annie's raised, and I think it's worth confronting. It is the case that they're not necessarily NUJ members, by the way, who are writing this stuff hostile to Assange. But Michelle, do you want to respond to that?
I'm sure it's the case that some are. I don't believe it would be true to say the vast majority are hostile. From the NUJ's perspective, we have opposed these efforts from the outset. We've had somebody there at every single hearing reporting on it, and also representing the International Federation of Journalists, which the NEJ is part of, and represents 600,000 journalists around the world, including Julian's own union in Australia. So, you know, we've worked very much in concert with our sister unions on that. I think, but, you know, probably there are, you know, people who hold particular views on Julian as a person, but really that's besides the point when it comes to this effort to extradite him and to prosecute him. It's quite clear that this is a danger to the whole journalistic community, as well as to him, and the obvious impact on him as an individual and his family is self-evident. So I think it's, you know, what we've tried to do is to raise awareness of that, the dangers of this, you know, this broader threat that this case poses, and why it shouldn't be allowed to take place, the extradition. So we've been doing, you know, a member of our executive who goes along to all these hearings and has written about the case a lot, has been going around speaking at lots of different events, you know, lots of different branch meetings of journalists, but also of many of the trade unions who we've tried to engage in this as a campaigning issue. So we'll continue to do that. But I would actually think from my own experience that the vast majority of journalists see the risk that this case poses to them and to the rest of the journalistic community.
Okay, thanks for that, Michelle. Anybody else want to come in from the panel on that question?
Yeah, I'm a slight dissident on the Assange issue from some of the people on this panel. Not that I don't agree with the principle of supporting Julian and the campaign, and the fact that the way that the American government has proceeded against him, and the way that the British government have collaborated in that procedure. But he's a complicated character, and he's a difficult individual, and he has brought, because of his actions, he's brought some problems on other journalists. He was an accidental journalist, Julian. He was not a trained journalist. He was not someone who, you know, who began life as a journalist, and he made some terrible mistakes. He played fast and loose with his sources, including me. And, you know, I ended up losing my job at New Statesman.
Martin, what happened? What happened?
Oh, I mean, because Julian's a freedom of speech fundamentalist,
Yeah.
he did the opposite of what I did with David, which is he immediately published what I'd given him on the website, which included legal letters from libel lawyers. Look, that has nothing.
We'll talk.
There's nothing. That has nothing compared to the treatment that's been meted out to Julian. But there are, you know, there are difficulties with some of the stuff that he published. Now, the point is, I think that with the new official secrets legislation, there is absolutely no doubt that what they have brought in order to bring journalists in line, punishments for journalists in line with punishments for traitors, is entirely designed to stop the sort of thing that Julian did. It's absolutely targeting the kind of mass, whatever you want to call them, data dumps or disclosures of government data that Julian did, and that is, you know, that is something we absolutely need to be campaigning on. And also, look, I mean, whatever my reservations about some of the things that some of the mistakes that Julian made, that does not mean I condone the treatment of him. So I just wanted to give a sort of slight. One of the reasons that some journalists don't support Julian is because of some of the things he's done in the past.
Okay, thank you for that, Martin. Anybody else want to come in on that one? No? Okay.
Well, I'm just wondering if Martin's talking about the leak of the password to the documents that gave access to agent names. That was David Lee.
Yeah, there's absolutely there's other people need to take responsibility for some of this.
I totally agree. I've argued with David Lee on stage about this. So.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's you know, there are other people that need to take responsibility too. But you know, if you are a free speech fundamentalist, which is what Julian is, it is likely that some of the stuff that you publish will have an effect on other people.
I do agree with that. Yeah.
And
it's such a delicate balance.
Yeah, absolutely is.
Okay, I'd like to move on. There's lots of questions coming up. This is one from Barry White. If the government announces its official secrecy legislation in the Queen's speech on 10th of May, what steps should we take to campaign against it? Now, Martin, you say you'd like to answer the question, but let me hand it over to some other people first, and we'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, so anybody else want to come in on that question first? If it's in the...
No, I'd rather lob it to Martin. I think it'd be better.
Okay. No one, do you?
Well, I'd only say I'd like to see possibly Snowden release some more files. I think that might be good, a bit of a bombshell. We haven't mentioned Snowden, who I think has done a tremendous amount to open up technology that's used by the intelligence services and what they actually have been up to in the last decade or so. He suffered, he obviously knew that he was going to be done. And his life is basically, in terms of coming back to America or wherever, has ended. But maybe there could be a release of material to coincide with it and kind of force it open. Because he's only released, I think, is something about 20% of the files that he actually got. So
I don't think it was his release, it was about the journalists he gave it to, so it was their control. Again, back to the blockage, which is what WikiLeaks tried to circumvent, but anyway, that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah.
So is that your response to that question, or is this something you were holding on to before?
Well, I think it's a hope. But I think it's a bit like any of the other things the government's going through at the moment. It's going to be challenged in Europe. Because I think this is a denial of fundamental rights, of holding governments to account. And so I think it will end up in the European Court, and maybe it should be taken there as soon as possible.
Right. This is a question from the Martin, sorry, do you want to come back in on
I'll just briefly say that I think we need to make a decision as a journalistic and freedom of expression campaigning community pretty quickly about what we're going to do about this piece of legislation, because it's coming down the tracks very, very quickly. The government has a workable majority. They will absolutely front load it with talk about national security, about traitors. They will absolutely point to Snowden and Assange as the bad guys that need to be stopped, and they will that's how they will go about pushing this legislation through. They'll also make actually quite a good argument about the need for legislation to be updated because this was pre-internet legislation. And so all of that's going to be quite compelling, and it's going to be quite difficult to fight. What we have to do at that point, I think, is decide whether we are going to go for a pragmatic parliamentary campaign with alliances with key conservative freedom of expression campaigners such as David Davis, whether we're going to work on having some sort of public interest defense embedded in that legislation, and how far we're prepared to go down the road of trade-offs. Right? I mean, the only way you're going to get change here is in that legislation, and amendments into that legislation is if people are prepared to accept some of what it gives in return for a public interest defense. Now that's
Martin, you work for Index on Censorship now, yes?
Yes.
So the key point I got from one of the most effective civil campaigners I've ever met is the most pain and the most embarrassment. That is how you change government policy.
Well, I think that's correct, but it's one thing to say, as a matter of principle, I personally am opposed to pretty much everything in the Official Secrets Act. And you could have a campaign that involves opposing it in toto. But, you know, at the same time, the successful parliamentary campaigns that get reform done end up making compromises and being pragmatic. So, you know, that's the question we need to ask ourselves. I mean, I'm not saying I fall down on one side or the other, but, you know, in campaigning terms, we're going to need to think about that really, really hard.
Michelle, do you want to come in on this, please?
Sorry,
Yeah, I mean,
I was just going to say, finally, Martin, we're definitely talking after this.
Martin and I are talking as well. We've kind of agreed to meet up imminently, but the NUJ, as we've done already on this and in other ways, will work with, you know, sister organisations like Index on Censorship and others to come together and try and have a coordinated approach to it. We've got a cross-party parliamentary group, so they're geared up already to help in that way. And I think there are lots of voices across Parliament that, you know, have huge concerns over these elements of the bill. So I think there absolutely will be cross-party support for some of these important principles that we'll be pushing.
Okay, I'm just looking through some questions here. There's one, well, it links in actually. It's from John Johnson. With an 80-seat majority, there is no way we will stop anything this government wants to do. How do the panel think we can proceed in order to prevent further erosion of basic rights, be they journalistic, whistleblower, protester, or anyone who is concerned about honesty, fairness, and integrity in the US? Now, I think we've looked at the tactics of this particular issue, how we try and deal with it. But there is a basic problem, isn't there, that Priti Patel, one of the most illiberal Home Secretaries that we've had to confront on a range of issues, we are seeing this sort of legislation on the right to protest. So I think that it's a reality that we have to confront. If we are going to try to get some kind of movement to get the worst aspects of the Official Secrets Act. By the way, I think Annie calling it an Espionage Act, I think it's very interesting as an explanation for it, because what you were saying there earlier on was revelatory, the way it's been, it's the recreating an act from the early 19th century, early 20th century, sorry.
It so anybody else there was the 1911 Official Secrets Act. It's only the Americans that have the 1917 Espionage Act, which is what's been used to crush all the whistleblowers over the last 20 years. The UK's never had that.
Right.
The Official Secrets Act has always been the thing that's crushing whistleblowers and being used. And now they're going to change the name to Espionage Act. Lovely. So there's a lot for us to do, both to protect people who are sources of journalists and people who are the journalists who are trying to expose the wrongdoing of corporations or governments or spies or whatever.
Okay, Stephen?
A small point is, it was brought up by Martin, it's this terrible word, securitization, that there is bound to be, parallel to bringing in the Act in Parliament, a series of stories about terrorism, the war, espionage, all those kind of things. I think it's one of the things of journalists to keep an eye on this and, you know, batter them down as soon as they appear, because they will do. Because it's a strange kind of world, because actually, certainly in Europe, terrorism is at its lowest for decades. And yet terrorism is used to bring in some of these acts and to clamp down on information. And I'm sure that's what Patel and the people in MI5, whatever, will do in the summer.
Okay, I've got a question that links into something we referred to earlier. I think it was you, Steve, that mentioned the war in Ukraine and intelligence. And it's a question, really, is there any, can we ever justify the role of intelligence services? Is there a positive role for intelligence services? Or as you're suggesting, should we make everything transparent? I mean, in terms of it, we hear a lot about an intelligence war in the Ukraine. Is there any validity? Was the stuff that's been put out there inaccurate disinformation? Maybe you, Steve, first.
Well, there is a case for intelligence, and we can see it in action in Ukraine, because you want basic things like order of battle. You want to know what weapons are being used, all those kind of things. Where it kind of falls down is, in our case, is we do not have any spies within the Kremlin. We haven't a clue what is really going on. We don't know what Putin is doing. And the record of both MI6 and CIA, the foreign intelligence agencies, over the last 50 years is basically the same. They haven't had the sources at the highest levels. It doesn't work, but they're very good at kind of lower down, as we're seeing in Ukraine. The stuff that's been coming out, the leaks, is about like movement of troops and tanks and all those kind of things, which is basically electronic intelligence. And that is absolutely huge. And it works. But a lot of the human intelligence stuff hasn't been that successful. And even when it comes to terrorism, it hasn't been very successful. And certainly not in the last, say, probably decade, where there aren't the organized Al-Qaeda, etc. It's down to so-called lone wolves. And MI5 simply hasn't been very good at doing that. So you always need intelligence, whether you need covert intelligence on the scale that we've got, because remember, we now have agencies that are bigger than any stage in the last, well, any time since the Second World War. But you can have intelligence that is open source. And given the amount of information in the world, that's probably the direction that a lot of it will go.
Okay, thank you. Martin or Annie?
I would tend to agree with that. We have a situation now where so much information is out there on the internet. It's not being guarded, it's not being protected, it can be predated on. So yes, open intelligence, open source intelligence is there. I would also agree with Steve that the real crown jewels of intelligence come from intelligence agents that you recruit, and they're not being recruited because there's been this huge reliance on just grabbing everything on the internet over the last 20 years. And that's been a huge problem. That's why most of our intelligence agencies have missed people who commit terrorism over the last 20 years or so.
I think there was some, I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that if we live within nation states, it's likely there are likely to be intelligence agencies. People will have read about tales of daring do in the Second World War, or you know, there's the film Operation Mincemeat that's out in the cinemas at the moment. You know, these are, you know, tales of brave individuals fighting fascism using
which was
intelligence.
great, but it's pre-internet. Yeah. I mean, the whole cyber warfare thing, Martin, at the moment going on between
that's one
the West
point,
and the East. Yeah.
But also, well, I think that the you know, there's a difference between that kind of wartime intelligence, the job of the intelligence services, and then what we found, and Stephen was fantastic on this period of intelligence history. People find it difficult to believe now, but when I first started reporting on intelligence matters, one of the biggest debates inside the intelligence services was, what are we for? You know, there was, you know, you remember there were the discussions about the merging of the intelligence services. There was huge amounts of inventing work for the intelligence services. Yeah. So, you know, there was like giving huge chunks of kind of criminal investigation to MI5 because obviously there was no internal threat from communist spies. I mean, that was one of the things that David did so well in exposing, was the kind of nonsense of the spying on a non-existent internal threat. Then the threat of Northern Ireland went away, and so suddenly people were thinking, what on earth is there for intelligence services?
But then Al-Qaeda was there.
Well, Al-Qaeda was there, and you know, of course, not enough was done in advance of that particular threat.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point, is that there was a kind of intellectual and moral corruption of the intelligence services in the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, Stephen knows much more about this than I do. That meant that a lot of people, particularly on the liberal left of British politics, absolutely learned to distrust what the intelligence services said it was for and what it was doing. And we're still burnt, I think, by that particular period. I mean, I'd love to hear what Stephen says about that, because it's his area of expertise.
Well, I think one of the interesting things was the reaction to that, which was the PR exercise, basically. And MI5 did bring in PR people. And there is this kind of really odd thing that, it's obvious, we all know, the MI6 building. Here is a secret intelligence service that doesn't release any files. And I talk to people and they say, I think my father or mother were in MI6, got all this evidence. And I approach MI6 and they won't say anything. They just deny anything. And yet James Bond is their big selling figure. They say they don't like James Bond, but actually they love James Bond because they're around the world. So there's a big PR exercise. And you mentioned mincemeats, which is another kind of PR exercise. And I think the reality is MI5 have released a lot of files from the war. And the more files they release, the less impressive it becomes. I think when they didn't release any files, we had double cross and various other things, and it's very impressive. But then once you start to get into the files, you think it's less impressive. And you discover the Germans were doing the same, really. And we weren't the only ones doing it. But I think they have a problem now. If you look at any scandals to do with intelligence over the last 50 years, the inquiries into it basically come down to the same thing. They all had the intelligence, but they didn't know how to analyze it. They were overwhelmed by the material. And we've seen it recently in the Manchester bombing and various others, Falklands and others, that there aren't enough analysts, there aren't enough specialists, and they're collecting all of this stuff. And it's the point you made earlier, Martin, what's it for? What are they doing? And I don't think they really know in a lot of instances. And I think that's one of the lessons of Snowden, that they are collecting huge amounts, trying to find the needle in the haystack, and they're not very good at it. And I think they have problems get bigger and bigger.
Okay, I've got a question here, which I think is a little bit, it's from Scott Dart. Is it possible for international journalists to devise a code of conduct, mission statement of the role of a free press that directly contradicts the new bill, hopefully leading to a court case in the European courts to rule on the contradiction? The judiciary seems to be the last line of defense against the government at the moment. Not sure that makes sense. Well, I get the point that there needs to be some sort of action. Maybe I could link this with, because we're coming towards the end of the event, with another question from Natasha Hurst, and then we can put these to all of you. Natasha says, what more can we be doing to raise public understanding about the importance of challenging these proposed reforms? This is one of multiple efforts by UK government to undermine citizens' rights through legislative changes. So there's two questions together there. One, whether we can take any initiative on an international level. That might be something to put to you, Michelle, through your work with the European Federation of Journalists International Federation. And then maybe all of the panel to think about next steps, what we can do so people can take away something concrete from this meeting that they can do to highlight.
Can I actually answer that? Because I think, one, it's got to be about education. There are choices when it's out there. There needs to be education about why people should be interested in these arguments. And Michelle as well, I'm based in Brussels, so I know Jeremy Deere and various other people too. So I shall keep trying to move this stuff. But we need to have an awareness, the education of why these things are important. And we need to have the protection for the sources that expose the things that are important. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that education, that awareness raising that Natasha speaks of in her question is incredibly important. And I think everyone can help in that regard, can't they? It's discussions like these. It's people, you know, thinking about the issues, thinking about the, you know, what's the potential consequence of these changes that the government's trying to drive through and the agenda behind that. So I think the more we can raise awareness and persuade people to be part of a broader campaign that we'll certainly be pushing in the coming weeks, you know, then we'll be able to get people writing to their MPs and putting this on, you know, at the top of people's inboxes rather than something that just gets through on the nod. So I think we want to build that kind of coalition from an international perspective. It's certainly something the NUJ is going to be raising at the forthcoming World Congress of the International Federation of Journalists. So that's happening in a few weeks' time at the end of May. So the points being made about some sort of legal strategy or some sort of coordination around that campaign is definitely something that I'll be taking up there.
I'm going to interrupt here as well. It's not just about the legal strategy, it's also about the technology that journalists use. We need to look at open source software to protect our sources, to protect our whistleblowers. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole particularly right now, but this is something that the NUJ really needs to look at.
Okay, Martin, thoughts on where we go next? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, the official secrets, the world of official secrets and official secrecy legislation has always been the preserve of quite a specialist group of people. Every now and again, you get a big case that people rally around, but generally speaking, this is something that happens in the kind of margins. And you know, I think what would be great is to kind of yoke this to other campaigns that are going on. So learn lessons from the anti-SLAPP campaigners, so the people who are campaigning against libel actions being taken by oligarchs. There's an amazing group of organizations that are involved in the UK and across Europe to come together. And again, it's all about solidarity. I think that's one thing, but also to yoke this legislation, as some of the questioners have said, some of the audience have said, to the other authoritarian legislation that's coming down the line. So I mean, it's quite easy to see if there's legislation that's trying to crack down on protest, it's quite easy to see how you would protest that, which is to protest, right? So that's quite a simple process. Actually imagining at a campaign how you would protest official secrecy is slightly trickier, always has been, particularly as it involves national security. But I think if you could yoke it to those two campaigns, the anti-libel campaign and the campaign to crack down on protests, then I think there's something in there. Okay, Steve.
I agree totally with Martin, and I think it just needs to be wound out. And I think on one level, the Labour Party has to play a role. And I think it should really be about the wider campaign for democracy in this country. Democracy, freedom of information. I think we've seen with COVID, with the war, events that have gone on in the last few years, how undemocratic this country is. Yeah. And if there's a campaign for the Labour Party, is to renew democracy across all levels. And I think the attack on official secrecy, etc., is part of that, with a much stronger Freedom of Information Act, protection for whistleblowers, and more European support, I think.
Well, I will finish by saying I am based in Brussels. If any of you have some, contacts or suggestions of people I can talk to, I'd be very happy to follow them up. And I'm also going to make a shameless cry out for an organisation I do work for, which is the World Ethical Data Forum. We bring all these tech people together from across the world, talking about all sorts of different aspects of online privacy, online protections, online campaigning. And if any of you are interested, it's just worldethicaldata.org. So that's a very shameless plug.
Okay, well, we'll let you do that. I mean, you're from Brussels. We give you some privilege there. Okay, I just want to finish by, I think we've focused on a lot of points. I've certainly learned a lot from some of the information that's been pumped out tonight. So I want to thank you for that. We missed one or two people from questions, but you have to understand we've got to finish in about 2 or 3 minutes. Can I first of all thank all of the people who have taken part as a panel? Thank you very much for that. I'd also like to thank Barry White, who helped to organise this event, in the sense that he also suggested Annie and Martin to speak. So thank you for that. But also, I do think that this is an issue. That's why we chose it. This is the one event we were going to put on at Festival of Debate this year. This was the one. And so I think, and that's because we thought it was so important to get some public awareness out there about it. But can I give a plug, finally, for our second event, which is, again, put on because of the attack on public service broadcasting, which is coming up. It's called What Has the BBC Ever Done for Us? And it's got Dorothy Byrne, former head of News and Current Affairs at Channel 4, Paddy Barwise, who's written with a co-authored an excellent book on the war on the BBC, Paulette Edwards, a presenter with BBC Radio Sheffield, and Tom Mills, who's head of the, or is the chair of the Media Research Coalition, Media Reform Coalition, sorry. So that's on the 12th of May, and please look on the festival site to look for that. But to conclude, I thank you very much, both the panelists and the audience, for giving up an hour and a half of your time for tonight's events. Thanks ever so much, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Granville, for hosting tonight's event. Thank you. Good night. Cheers.